Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 413. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news today. Unfortunately, it's pretty much all bad news, but I got a lot of news to talk about in today's show, so definitely share the show. You find it at the Libertarian Institute, the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you could listen to podcasts, and wherever you're listening, if you're a new listener, subscribe. If you've been listening for a while, recommend it to someone that really will help grow the show. And with that, let's get into it. All right, big story today. Record American military spending tops next 11 countries combined. I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute on April 24th. Global weapon expenditures hit a record $2.24 trillion in 2022, an increase of nearly 4%. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and that is SPRI, SIPRI. The global watchdog found the trend was led by European countries returning to Cold War levels of spending, though the United States remains the world's largest weapons spender by far. SPRI released its annual report on Monday, and you know these come out every year. I think they've been doing them for about 30 years. Finding worldwide military expenditures had increased for the 8th consecutive year. Dr. Nan Tan, a senior researcher with SPRI's military expenditure and arms production program, said the continued rise in global military expenditure in recent years is a sign we are living in an increasingly insecure world. Overall, European military spending increased by 13% in 22. For many nations on the continent, weapon expenditures increased to levels not seen since the Cold War. During the same period, Finland plus 37%, Lithuania plus 27%, Sweden plus 12%, and Poland plus 11%, each increased their military budget more than Russia, which saw a 9.2% jump amid the war in Ukraine. Kiev's year-to-year war spending increased by a staggering 640%, reaching $44 billion. Now, let's go through and look at some of this. Of course, with Finland and Sweden on that list, you had the two countries that applied to join NATO last year, and so maybe this is a part of their effort to get into the alliance, boosting military spending, probably spending more, particularly on American weapons, to make sure that they have the American and military industrial complex on their side. Lithuania and Poland being Baltic states, not surprising, they have been some of the most aggressive supporters of the proxy war in Ukraine. And of course, it is understandable that Ukraine saw a massive increase in their military spending as, that country was invaded. Now, we could talk for episodes about how that war could have been prevented and everything like that. But, once the war starts, you do understand that Ukraine is, fighting a war against Russia, who has invaded their country. So, that's an important note. And I'm not trying to say that, Ukraine increased their military budget by a lot for no reason. There's a pretty good reason behind that one. American military spending continues to smash records, having long held the number one spot for the largest military. According to the SPRI report, the nearly $20 billion in weapons Washington shipped to Kiev in 22 is the largest amount of security assistance one country has ever provided to another in a single year. Additionally, the U.S. remained the world's largest military spender at $877 billion, more than the total of the budgets of the next 11 top spending countries combined. Many other high-spending nations are allies of Washington, which military expenditures among NATO members topping $1.23 trillion. So that's a little bit more than half, actually, of the total world military spending is spent by NATO. And, I say this all the time, but I really wish that even maybe the American firsters would kind of adopt this narrative, because I don't think we need all this military spending. However, if you're, in the Pentagon, right, or if you're in Washington saying the U.S. needs to spend $877 billion a year on war, I think you actually need to address and explain why China could spend 3 times less on its military than the U.S., 4 times less on its military than the NATO alliance, and at the same time, present a threat to us. Like, we should be irate with our weapons makers if they are so inefficient at their jobs that they could spend 4 times what China does and still be at some kind of disadvantage. And so I really wish that that's something that people would start to bring up and say, even though I do understand, kind of, agrees with some of the pro-war premises there. But at the same time, I do think we should really hate our military-industrial complex, because, not only have they made trillions of dollars off all these wars, they've also made hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars off these weapons platforms that don't perform well. And they still say we got more and more and more. Well, if you can't produce good warplanes, then maybe we need to look at a different manufacturer, or stop buying so many. But that's really not where the conversation goes. William Hartung, a senior researcher at the Quincy Institute, explained that increasing military outlays are a bad sign for peace, while stressing the importance of diplomacy. He wrote, the surge in spending does not bode well for global peace and stability. The prospects for war and peace hinge on more than just money spent, he wrote in his article, adding, the key question is whether diplomatic incentives aimed at ending conflicts and reducing mounting tensions among major powers can take precedent over war preparations for government and government policies. And obviously, that's nowhere near happening in the U.S. So I think that's all I have on weapons, but really want to bring that up. I think it's an important thing to talk about every year when it comes up, how much more the U.S. spends than the rest of the world. And so many of those countries are allies. If you look at the, top 11 countries, that includes Russia and China, of course, but also Saudi Arabia, India, the UK, Italy. I think Australia is the next country on that list. Japan is on that list. So you have all these countries, firm American allies, who we still, had to count them on that total, or we would never, we probably spend more than any country we even could remotely label as an adversary combined. Even you look at Russia, China, North Korea, Venezuela, Syria, Iran, you throw in a couple more, maybe Somalia or something like that. Even though we give weapons to that government, there's a significant portion of Somalia that is, Al-Shabaab isn't really an enemy of the United States. Even that would be hard to say. But they are fighting a conflict against the U.S.-backed government. So if you want to throw them on the list, if you want to throw the Taliban on that list, you're still not going to get to $877 billion. All right. Next up, just a quick talk about the failed U.S. coup in Venezuela. This is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, April 25th. Venezuela's opposition figure Juan Guaido, who the U.S. backed in a failed coup attempt against Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, landed in Miami on Tuesday and is seeking refuge in the U.S., the Washington Post reported. The U.S. recognized Guaido as the interim president in 2019, the same year of the attempted coup. The Trump administration's backing of Guaido and the imposition of crippling sanctions on Venezuela were a part of the failed regime change effort. And there were, it was really like a 3-year long ongoing coup attempt, because, Guaido was proclaiming that he was the president the entire time. He was running around Venezuela, Latin America, different places, doing different things. There were a couple, more significant things that were, I think, actual coup attempts, like when he first announced the protest movement that they tried to form afterwards. There was a time where he went to outside a military base and was calling for people to join him. So, all these things happened, and Guaido never gained any even small amount of power in Venezuela. In fact, for a lot of the time, Maduro just let him run around. And, it's not like he arrested him. You imagine in most countries, and probably even the U.S., that if Trump was running around, a couple of years after just proclaiming himself president, if he held a separate inauguration from Joe Biden or something like that, they probably arrest him eventually. And here, that really didn't happen in Venezuela. And in part, it's because Guaido, I think, was such a marginal figure that was the best way to deal with him. So over the years, Guaido has lost what little support he had. The U.S. backed Venezuela's opposition recently removed him as interim president and disavowed the interim government, which never had power besides the ability to access some of Venezuela's offshore assets and foreign embassies. And so, this government that the U.S. Put together under the Trump administration, I think, John Bolton probably had a big hand in this. These governments, right, this government in Venezuela, the power it had was only the power the U.S. bestowed upon it, which meant the U.S. could give it access to all these international accounts, the United Nations and, maybe some different international bodies. The Venezuelan opposition could represent Venezuela there, but the U.S. actually doesn't really have any power inside of Venezuela. And so inside the country, Guaido had zero power all these years. Guaido flew to the U.S. after entering Colombia, where the Colombian president Petro is hosting an international conference on Venezuela that includes diplomats from 20 countries. Guaido made it to the capital of Bogota and claimed he was expelled from Colombia. The persecution of the dictatorship unfortunately spread to Colombia today, Guaido said in a recorded video message on the plane, but Colombian officials, including Petro, denied Guaido was expelled. Mr. Guaido was not expelled, and it is better that this lie does not appear in politics, Petro said on Twitter. So unclear, exactly what's going on here, why he's fleeing to the United States, why he left Venezuela. Colombian authorities said Guaido entered Colombia irregularly and escorted him to the airport for a flight to the U.S., where Guaido's mother and brother live. The State Department later said American diplomats in Colombia helped bring Guaido to the United States. The Biden administration has kept Venezuela under crippling sanctions and only issued a limited license to Chevron, allowing the company to resume pumping oil in Venezuela. An envoy for Venezuela's opposition recently called on the U.S. to lift all sanctions on Venezuela. The position is a significant departure from Guaido, who favored sanction and foreign military intervention to put him in power in Caracas. And that is another note. They actually did try, like a little Bay of Pigs in Venezuela. They landed a couple dozen men on the shore of that country who were pretty quickly arrested, but just another one of Guaido's coup attempts there. So it looks like, it's been over for a while. There was never any real effort Guaido made, that really threatened Maduro in Venezuela. And so you could say it never really started. But the U.S., proclaiming anybody to be president of any country gives that person quite a bit of power. And so, it did end probably several months ago now. However, him coming to the United States will be an interesting development and see where we go from here. So next up, Politico. Biden preparing for failed Ukrainian counteroffensive. This is really big. The Biden administration is preparing for the possibility of Ukraine's long-awaited counteroffensive failing, Politico reported on Monday. Pentagon documents allegedly leaked by Airman Jet Teixeira revealed that the U.S. doesn't believe Ukraine can regain any significant territory in its counteroffensive, which is expected to be launched this spring. The information in the leaks was based on an assessment made in February. According to Politico, more current assessments also don't expect much Ukrainian success. Two Biden administration officials said they don't think Kiev has the ability to sever Russia's land bridge to Crimea in the Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblast. The report said the U.S. intelligence indicates that Ukraine simply doesn't have the ability to push Russian troops from where they are deeply entrenched. Ukrainian President Zelensky said in March that his forces needed more Western weapons before they can launch a counteroffensive. The administration is expected to face criticism from hawks who believe Biden hasn't given Ukraine enough weapons, as well as those who have been calling for the U.S. to lead a push for diplomacy. The U.S. is also worried that many of its European allies will favor negotiations between the warring sides if the Ukrainian offensive fails. Since Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, the Biden administration has discouraged peace talks and recently came out against the idea of a ceasefire in Ukraine. The administration has left it up to Zelensky when to push for peace talks, and he still maintains they can't happen until Russia is driven from all the territory it controls, including Crimea. But now, according to Politico, there are discussions among administration officials about convincing Ukraine to accept more modest goals and agree to a temporary ceasefire. Possible ascents for Ukraine, giving Ukraine a NATO-like security guarantees and more military aid, although that may... So... the U.S. has to propose something reasonable that Russia will accept as well. And even if they make Ukraine's military goals more moderate here, and Ukraine agrees to cede even a significant amount of territory, if they're going to make Ukraine a NATO member, Russia might still object and, continue pushing forward with this war. The issue with the U.S. plan is that Russia signaled it won't settle for a frozen conflict, and it stated it can only achieve its war goals through military means. The Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov recently stated that one of Moscow's main priorities is keeping Kiev out of NATO after NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said Ukraine's rightful place is in the alliance. In the early days of the Russian intervention, Russian and Ukrainian officials were engaged in peace talks, and Moscow primarily demanded was for Ukrainian neutrality, but now Kiev stands to lose much more as Russia maintains any settlement must include recognition of the areas it annexed in the Donbass, Kherson, and Zaporizhia Oblast as Russian territory. So, with the initial agreements, Russia was willing to pull out of, I think, everything except essentially Crimea. And, now they're saying they're not going to do that, and they're going to keep taking territory until they achieve their military means and then ensure Ukraine never joins NATO. So compare that to this next story we have here, which is why I think we are in so much trouble, as a species, and the potential for a real World War III breaking out, a real conflict between the U.S. and Russia is potentially very close. House resolution would declare U.S. policy is to seek Ukrainian victory. Representative Joe Wilson, he's a Republican from South Carolina, is planning to introduce a resolution in the House that would declare a U.S. policy to seek a Ukrainian victory against Russia, which includes returning all Russian-controlled territory to Kiev. According to Yahoo News, the resolution affirms that it is the policy of the United States to see Ukraine victorious against its invasion and restore to internationally recognized 1991 borders. So that includes Crimea, the Donbass, Kherson, Zaporizhia, all these areas that Russia firmly controls, areas that Russia has now annexed into the Russian Federation. This bill right here says that we have to take that we have to help Ukraine take that territory back. And look, we know that that's impossible. Now, I know if you've just been listening to the Biden administration over the past year, and you don't listen or don't bother to read all these leaked reports in Politico and the leaks that Jad Teixeira put out, you would think, oh, Ukraine's planning a counteroffensive. They're going to take back a bunch of territory. Then they're going to hold negotiations with Russia. Putin's feet are going to be held to the fire, and his forces are going to have to withdraw from Ukraine. But that is simply not going to happen. The story I just talked about that I think is a pretty good affirmation of that they are expecting that this counteroffensive is not going to go well. Means that what this resolution is proposing is simply impossible. The resolution is co-sponsored by a Democrat, Representative Steve Cohen from Tennessee, and will need to make it through the House Foreign Affairs Committee before it can be put to the floor for a vote. The committee is chaired by Representative Michael McCall, a Republican from Texas, who has been calling on President Biden to arm Ukraine with longer-range weapons so that it could strike Crimea. The news comes after the leaks allegedly leaked by Airman Jad Teixeira revealed the Biden administration doesn't think Ukraine can regain territory in its expected counteroffensive. The Pentagon has also told Congress it's unlikely that Ukraine will be able to retake Crimea. Despite the U.S. assessment, Ukrainian President Zelensky and his top aides maintain peace talks can't happen until Russia is expelled from Crimea and territory it captured since launching last year's invasion, making it U.S. official policy to support these goals would guarantee a prolonged conflict and would risk escalation that could lead to a NATO-Russia conflict. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has previously acknowledged a Ukrainian attempt to retake Crimea would cross a red line for Russian President Vladimir Putin. A congressional staffer who supports the resolution told Yahoo the bill contains a wide support in Congress for Ukrainian victory. We all need to move beyond as long as it takes and embrace Ukrainian victory as our rallying cry in order for Ukraine to win the war this year. So, this is absolutely insane the way they're talking about escalating this war. It doesn't reflect in any way what the reality on the ground in Ukraine is, and it is just going to lead to massive escalations with Russia. Now, another way we could see a massive escalation with Russia is if Ukraine ramped up its war effort, and this is one of those reasons why you probably really don't want to give Ukraine F-16 or any other long-range weapons, is because Ukraine was planning to launch a massive attack against Moscow. So this is, the Washington Post reported Monday that Ukraine's military intelligence directorate, known as HUR, was planning major strikes inside Russia in February that were postponed due to U.S. pressure. The report cited documents allegedly leaked by Airman Jat Teixeira, according to a report from the National Security Agency. HUR Chief Major General Bondavu has instructed one officer to get ready for mass strikes on February 24th with everything that HUR had. The date marked 1 year since the Russian invasion. The U.S. became aware of the plans as it has been spying on Ukrainian officials. According to a CIA report dated February 22nd, the HUR had agreed at Washington's request to postpone the strikes. And postpone is a pretty important word there. The Post said it wasn't clear from the document how the U.S. pressured Kiev to push back against the operations. Throughout the war, Ukraine has launched small drone attacks and conducted other sabotage operations inside of Russia. It's not clear what the HUR meant by mass strikes. One plan mentioned by the Post was using TNT to attack the Black Sea port city of Russia. The Post report suggests that the U.S. didn't want the HUR to follow through with the plans over concerns of Russian escalation, but there are indications that the U.S. helped Kiev with other attacks inside of Russia. After Ukrainian drones hit an airfield deep inside Russia in December, NATO military sources also told the Asia Times that drones used U.S. satellites and GPS data to hit targets, despite the Biden administration's claim the U.S. didn't encourage or enable the attacks. Another leaked document that was first reported earlier this month suggested Zelensky would use long-range weapons to hit targets inside of Russia, despite assurances that he wouldn't. And so, if we give Ukraine the weapons, I do think we'll probably see them use them. All right, so this is an update from a story that I discussed on the show on Monday. EU, Japan reject Washington's proposal to ban exports to Russia. And so the last show, we talked about this report from Bloomberg News where the G7 was circulating a plan that would see the total all exports to Russia banned, and I'll explain this a little bit more as I go through this article. What we now learn from the Financial Times is that this is an American plan. So I write, an American plan to strengthen the economic war against Russia by banning all exports has not been well received by U.S. allies. According to the Financial Times, the European Union and Japan have pushed back against the trade embargo with Moscow. Last week, Bloomberg News reported Washington would seek to convince members of the Group of Seven to end its exports to Russia. While the U.S. attempted to isolate Moscow and cripple its economy after the invasion of Ukraine, Russia has weathered the Western sanctions. Additionally, G7 states have continued to trade with Russia. According to Trade Data Monitor, G7 countries, that's the U.S., Britain, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the European Union, exported $66 billion to Russia over the past 14 months. Washington's new proposal would shift how sanctions on Moscow are enforced. Currently, the U.S. and its allies blacklist particular Russian products, companies, and individuals, barring American business transactions with the targeted entities. If adopted, the export ban will prohibit all trade with Moscow unless there's an explicit exemption. So, imagine that right now you're given like a list, right? You have a list and you can't do business with these people, these companies, or sell Russia these products. But what they want to do is rip up that list essentially and then give you a new list. And the new list is going to be the, products that you can still send to Russia. I'm assuming, you got to be very careful not to do any business with any sanctioned entities and things like that. And this embargo would likely essentially shut down trade with Russia. We've seen with other countries, once the U.S. reaches this level of economic warfare, it really shuts down all trade entirely and not just limited to even the exempted items are typically not able to get through the sanctions at this point. So that's the proposal from Washington. On Monday, the Financial Times reported that Japan and the EU are refusing to sign on to the plan, though Washington was hoping to implement the export ban at the upcoming G7 summit in Hiroshima on May 19th. One official told Financial Times, from our perspective, it is simply not doable. Members of the G7 are open to signing on to a statement that calls for cracking down on people and businesses that attempt to evade sanctions on Moscow. Earlier this month, 2 U.S. Treasury officials traveled to Europe and threatened penalties on countries that do not fully cooperate with the economic war on Russia. The Kremlin said it would respond to the proposed trade ban by revoking a grain export agreement that was brokered by the UN and Turkey in July 22, which has allowed 23 million tons of food products to leave Ukraine's heavily mined Black Sea ports. And so that deal has been in jeopardy for a while, and it really seems like Washington is trying to kill it at this point. So I think I have one more article here on the war in Ukraine before we move on to some news about China. And this is really just about the U.S.-Russian relationship. So the director of the Russian Foreign Ministry's Arms Control Department said Tuesday that serious talks with the U.S. and other Western countries aren't possible. In the given circumstances, no major negotiations can be conducted with the United States or the West in general. He also said Russia might scrap its moratorium on its deployment of short and medium-range land-based missiles previously banned under the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which the Trump administration withdrew from in 2019. The U.S. accused Russia of violating the treaty. The INF banned ground-based launchers with a range of 310 to 3,400 miles. Russia insisted that the rocket in question had a range of only 298 miles, but the Trump administration denied the Russian claims and tore up the treaty. Russia also accused the U.S. of potentially violating the treaty by establishing the Aegis Ashore missile system in Romania and Poland. The system's Mk-41 vertical launchers, which can fit Tomahawk missiles, have a range of over 1,000 miles. Since pulling out of the INF, the U.S. has been developing ground launch systems for the Tomahawk that could eventually be deployed to Japan. And these systems, very importantly, those Tomahawk missiles can carry a nuclear payload. Russia also has an issue, I believe it's with the Predator drone, saying that stationing those in Europe, I believe, just shouldn't be allowed because you could strap a nuclear weapon on them and it would essentially make it a medium-range missile if, you just flew it somewhere and blew up that nuclear weapon. I'm not sure if that's even possible, but I did read that as another issue that the Kremlin had. But I think the main one was the Mk-41 launchers being in Eastern Europe. All right, now let's look at the provocations going on towards Taiwan, and there are a lot of them. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Taiwan in talks with the U.S. about weapons stockpile on or near island. The Taiwanese premier, Chen Cheng-jin, confirmed on Monday that the U.S. and Taipei are in talks about establishing contingency stockpiles of weapons for a future fight with China located on or near the island of Taiwan. The proposal of regional contingency stockpiles is still in the negotiation process, Chen said, according to the South China Morning Post. The 2023 National Defense Authorization Act that President Biden signed into law in December includes several measures to increase support for Taiwan, including the authorization to spend $100 million each year on regional contingency stockpiles for arms for Taiwan. So that'll be a lot of weapons over 10 years. That's $1 billion worth of weapons they plan on pouring into these stockpiles. Chen said the U.S. and Taiwan are in talks on the issue since the NDAA became law. Beijing is strongly against the growing military ties between Washington and Taipei. The U.S. launched major military exercises around Taiwan. Beijing launched major military exercises around Taiwan in response to Biden signing the NDAA. Taiwanese officials won't say if the plan is to establish the U.S. stockpile in Taiwan or at a U.S. base elsewhere in the region, such as Okinawa, or I guess the Philippines would be another option. If the stockpile is located in Taiwan, it likely won't be publicized over concerns about provoking a Chinese response. According to the Taiwanese news agency CNA, the U.S. has experience in stockpiling weapons in Taiwan, as it established depots on the island that were used in the bombings and missions during the Vietnam War. All right. So this next story is pretty much exactly what I predicted on the show. Representative Gallagher says war games show U.S. needs to arm Taiwan to the teeth. And so Representative Mike Gallagher has said congressional war games that simulate Chinese invasion of Taiwan show that the U.S. must arm Taiwan to the teeth. Gallagher is the head of a new House panel on China, which participated in the war games on Wednesday evening, a highly unusual move by members of Congress that demonstrate the U.S. government is preparing for a future war against Beijing. And I talked about this on the show. I said that, these war games, which I believe were run by CNAS, Center for New American Security, which is certainly a very foundational part of the military-industrial complex in this country, would be used to scare the pants off the members of Congress into giving the military industrial complex, the Pentagon, as much money as it needs for this fight. And so, I think this is basically a way that Congress allowed themselves to be conned. And unfortunately, it's going to cost the American people a lot of money. And the U.S. has really gained its entire empire in line with this. There is a very good new Caitlin Johnstone article out on this. And the way she ends that article is absolutely phenomenal. She said, it would be great if Australia was just, they went ahead and made Australia the 51st state. That way, at least they could pretend they get a vote in our fake elections. So that was absolutely fantastic, Caitlin. I really enjoyed that article. Australia planning major military overhaul to prepare for war with China. A government review of Australia's military capability has called for Australia to make sweeping changes to prepare for a future war with China, Australia's largest trading partner. According to Australian media, the review has triggered one of the greatest shifts in Australia's military since World War II. The review was conducted by the Australian Defence Minister and Angus Houston, who previously served as the head of Australia's Defence Forces. Smith and Houston said that Australia has entered the missile age and is no longer protected by its isolated location. They called for Australia to invest in more long-range missiles and drones and to boost domestic weapons manufacturing. The Australian government of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has endorsed the review and said it will increase military spending to fulfill the recommendations. The review called China's current military buildup the largest and most ambitious of any country since the end of the Second World War. This military buildup is occurring without transparency or reassurance to the Indo-Pacific region of China's strategic intent. The review said, as a consequence of China's buildup, for the first time in 80 years, we must go back to the fundamentals to take first principles approach as to how to manage and seek to avoid the highest level of strategic risk we now face as a nation, the prospect of major conflict in the region that directly threatens our national interests. The Chinese Foreign Minister Mao Ning hit back against the characteristic of Beijing's military mobilization. We do not pose challenge to any country. We hope certain countries will not use China as an excuse for a military buildup, and we refrain from hyping up China's military threat narrative. The release of the Australian review comes as the as the U.S., Britain, and Australia announced that the nuclear-powered submarine plans under the AUKUS military pact, which the three countries signed in 2021, and so they're going to provide, I think it's like something like 7 submarines under the AUKUS pact, and eventually Australia will be able to make their own AUKUS submarines, or at least, have the ability to manufacture or assemble those in Australia. The U.S. is encouraging its allies in the region to boost its military capabilities. Secretary of State Lloyd Austin welcomed news from Australia. It is the latest example of the pivotal role Australia plays in serving a free and open Indo-Pacific through participation in AUKUS and the Quad. Australia is also a member of the Quadrilateral Dialogue, which is the U.S., Australia, India, and Japan, and that is also a anti-China grouping of nations. I do believe there's even going to be an American military officer that is heavily involved in helping China militarize or modernize their military and build up their military here. So U.S. rehearsals were with China on Philippines Island south of Taiwan. Hundreds of U.S. Marines and U.S. Army soldiers participate in military exercises with the Philippines in the island of Bataan, just over 100 miles across the Bashi Channel from Taiwan. And so if anybody's watching, you could see a map here, but it almost looks like, kind of off center to the right, but the midway point between Taiwan and the larger Philippines islands. The exercises are a part of these larger Bokatan exercises, which are being touted as the largest ever military drills between the U.S. and the Philippines. They come after the U.S. inked a deal expanding its military presence in the Philippines, all a part of Washington's plans to prepare for a future conflict with China. Oh, here's that map, a little bit better view for anybody, again, watching the show here. Let's move on. U.S. B-1 bomber drills in India for the first time. The U.S. has deployed a pair of B-1B Lancer bombers to participate in exercises in India, making it the first time the aircraft is conducting drills in the country as military tensions, ties between Washington and New Delhi are growing, and of course military tensions between the U.S. and China are growing. China and India have a disputed border up in the Himalayas. For anybody who's really interested in that, I highly recommend Eric Margolis' War at the Top of the World. Fantastic book on really, a lot of history of India, Pakistan, and China, but, mainly centers around this region, the Himalayas and Tibet. Well, all the different factors going on there. And Margolis is a fantastic writer, so I really recommend anybody interested in reading the book. So the 2023 iteration of the U.S.-India COPE exercises is now being held at in an India Air Force Station in its eastern state of West Bengal. The drills started on April 13th and will last until April 24th. So I guess they just wrapped up earlier this week. Other U.S. aircraft participating include F-15 fighter jets, C-130 cargo planes, and C-17 transport aircraft. The first time the American B-1 bombers have landed in India was in 2021 for an air show, according to Air and Space Force magazine. B-1s have become a regular sight in the Indo-Pacific region lately, as the U.S. has been sending them to fly with the South Korean military as tensions on the Korean Peninsula also continue to soar. So, there's kind of this thing happening in the region that it doesn't seem many people in the U.S. really take note of, and that is the Americans are engaging in military buildups and provocations against both China and North Korea. And while they're often presented in the U.S. media as being in separate buckets, because those two countries share a border, they're so close, military provocations and military buildups against China concern North Korea, and war games and things like that, preparing for war against North Korea upset and concern China, and so that making a lot of matters worse in this area. Now, a couple more stories before I wrap up here. This one, the European Union's Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell has called on the European Union countries to send warships through the Taiwan Strait. This is just absurd. Look at a map. Europe is nowhere near China. Europe should not be concerned. America, Canada should not be concerned about what's going on in the Taiwan Strait. And yet, this is an area that we are, prepared to draw a line and go to war for. And this is absolutely insane. So this is some really bad news, and is likely going to, be another major provocation between the West and China that could lead to a larger conflict. Now, the little bit of good news here is that, of course, France is a member of the European Union. For the European Union to do much of anything, officially at least. Now, I think what Borrell is calling for is say, he wants Italy, Rome, to just do this, right? He doesn't want it to be a coordinated European Union action, or at least understands that that's probably unlikely. And if it was, France could object to it, but at the same time, maybe France is willing to do this because, France has said that they want to have a relationship with China going forward. Macron recently visited China, but at the same time, the Taiwanese media report that a French warship sailed through the Taiwan Strait from April 9th to 10th. And, again, this is just interesting timing and everything like that, given Macron's visit. But I would at least hope that the European Union as a group, and, Paris being the country that is at least a little bit concerned about provoking things too far with China, may prevent the bloc from doing anything as a bloc. But at the same time, the more European warships that are sailing through the Taiwan Strait, the more it's going to provoke Beijing and make Beijing, I think about taking Taiwan back with its military. And so we have the Chinese foreign minister, Qin Gang, said on Friday that China would never bat down on the issue of Taiwan, which Beijing views as its own territory, and a warning aimed at the U.S. and the government in Taipei. Quinn made the state comments towards the end of a speech on China's contributions to the global economy. The Taiwan problem is at the core of China's core interest. He said, "We will never bat down in the face of any act that undermines China's sovereignty and security. Those who play with fire on the question of Taiwan will burn themselves." And so, again, this is just a really important thing to keep in mind, that this is one of Beijing's absolutely core concerns, and we are doing everything we can, not only to push them, from Washington, but also, we want all of our allies involved here, our allies surrounding China, and to push this thing as far as possible, which, of course, is going to make Beijing feel cornered and make Beijing feel like it has to act. Last up here, South Korea's Yoon says U.S. spying won't impact ties. And this is, one of the reasons I was very skeptical of the Jat Tashera elites at first, was because South Korea didn't seem to be reacting to the fact that its leader had been spied on. However, it may just be that Yoon is firmly in the Western camp and really sees, basically South Korea's place as a member of the U.S. empire, and, as such, he's going to be spied upon. That's just something that he has to deal with. So, this is interesting, and I think he's coming to the U.S. soon, and we're probably going to see some more American military commitments and promises towards Seoul that will likely only increase tensions with North Korea. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Please continue to share the show if you can, and I'll be back with another show this week.